Before we turn to Psalm 46, I want to do something different. I want you to turn to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4. I know that sounds weird when you are studying a psalm that the first passage we go to is Mark chapter 4, but I just couldn't help but think of a connection that's there that may establish an idea, something I want us to take away from the psalm that will help us in our study of it. When we go to Mark chapter 4, we find an account that's probably very familiar to us. Verses 35 and following, you'll see that Jesus and His disciples are on the Sea of Galilee. In verse 35 it says, "On the same day when the evening had come, He said to them, 'Let us cross over to the other side.' Now when they had left the multitude, they took Him along in the boat as He was, and the other little boats were also with Him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boats so that they were already filling. But He was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they woke Him and said to Him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And then He arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' The wind ceased. There was great calm. But He said to them, 'Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?' And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey Him?'" When we look at this passage, we see the disciples are distraught. I mean, isn't that a good word to use? There was one time in my life where I was caught in a storm. We were out on Lake Erie. And at first, it was one of those things that as a young kid, I thought, this is awesome, because you have no fear. And as the waves got about 8 feet and the boat was crashing, I thought, Dad's got this. But there came a point when you started realizing, oh, he's heading for a safe harbor. He's trying to get out of the waves because it's dangerous. This is a situation in which the apostles are doing everything they can. And really, when you look at the three parallel accounts, you see Mark 4, Luke 8, and Matthew 8, you'll see that the waves are beating into the boat, that it was already filling. That's what Mark tells us. Luke says they were in jeopardy. Matthew was saying that the boat was covered in waves. And so when you think about it, they're in the midst of a crisis situation, and what are they doing? And my answer is, they're doing everything they can. It doesn't specifically mention it, but if a boat's filling, what's the natural reaction? You're bailing, right? You're trying to get the water out of the boat. It's not supposed to be in the boat. And I wonder how long this took place until they finally turned to Jesus, and in desperation, exasperation, because you kind of hear that, don't you? "Master, do you care that we are perishing?" They finally turned to Jesus. You know what I realized about that? They turned to Him when they had nowhere else to turn. When it got too much for themselves and they realized, okay, we're in jeopardy here. But the truth of the matter is, He had power all along to do what He could do in that storm. And I think really that's what Jesus is getting at, isn't it? When He stands up, because the answer to the question doesn't even need to be vocalized. Did He care? Absolutely. But He stands up and He rebukes the wind and the waves. And with those powerful words, "Peace, be still," the water just calmed. And I wonder if we don't approach our storms that way sometimes. There's a few lessons to learn from this, by the way. Just because they're in the boat with Jesus did not immune them from storms. And it's the same with us. We'll develop that more as we go into Psalm 46. Being one of God's children does not mean you're not going to face times that we describe as storms. Jesus had power over the storm, but they didn't involve Him until they were in over their heads, until things were out of hand. They wore themselves out doing everything they could do, and they still got nowhere. And what I realized as I was thinking about this is Jesus did not commend them for their actions. You know, we live in a culture that says, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Our ego and our pride often keep us from asking for help. That's true among people, and it's also true with our relationship with God. And what I found in ministry that we've been in for how many years now? 25 years of preaching and stuff. What I've realized is that so often people they're dealing with the crisis in their life, and they're trying to do everything they possibly can, and they're getting nowhere. And they're going to be at the same place later on. They're just going to be more wore out. They're going to be exasperated. They're going to be asking questions that they know they aren't true. They're going to look at God and they're going to say, okay, God, where are you in all this? And the whole time God's there, and He has the power to help, or at least the power to help them through, and they never avail themselves of the refuge that He provides. And I just want you to remember, when you go through your storm, maybe you've been through one. You know, they say we're either we've been through a storm, we're in the midst of a storm, or we're heading into one. Go to God immediately and ask Him for the assistance that only He can provide. And we will save ourselves a whole lot of heartache and a whole lot of pain if we approach these things with God helping us from the onset, and not just at that time we finally are willing to overcome our pride and say, God, help me. So let's get into Psalm 46. Psalm 46 is a beautiful psalm. There it is. Psalm 46 is a beautiful psalm. It's a psalm that did really resonate with me, as Alan said when he was asking. It's one that has some words that, especially in the past couple of years, have been words that I have repeated and that have been a help to me. It's a very short psalm. You know, there's some psalms that are they're hard to tackle. You know, Psalm 119 is one of those that you need weeks to deal with that, not just one lesson. This is one which we can manage tonight together. It's easily broken up into three sections, three parts. And I've kind of labeled it this way. You've got God's unshakable presence, His unwavering protection, and His unmatchable power. That's a real brief outline if you want to kind of think about how we can look at this psalm. Each section is divided by itself because each section deals with or ends with the word Selah, which is an interesting word that, you know, as I was getting to it, I thought, what does that mean? And then I started researching it, and there's a lot of people asking, what does that mean? There's some who think that maybe it's there for musical direction, kind of as a pause in the music. Then there are others who say, no, that's too simple of an interpretation. It probably has more a literary interpretation, where it's saying, okay, yes, stop, but reflect. I like that idea, and I think that makes a lot of sense, especially in this psalm, where later on he's going to be saying, be still and know that I'm God. It makes a lot of sense that as you go through it, at different points, as he's making these powerful and passionate points, that he says, now think about that. And especially when we're in the midst of our times of crisis and struggle, there are times where we need to heed the direction of God to stop and to reflect and to think about the things that would really make a difference in those moments. And so as we go into this psalm, what can we learn? Number one is a point I've already brought up, but I believe this is a psalm that, again, deals with the reality of the troubles that we face in this life. And that's probably a point we could attach to many of the Psalms. Psalms are a poetic language, very figurative, have these figurative imagery that comes out. And so as you go, this poetic language kind of pulls at you. And so much of it is coming from a place of pain. I mean, many of David's Psalms, you'll even have a little heading at the beginning that'll tell you when David was hiding in a cave or when David was running from Saul. And it'll help us understand the context. And so often that context is pain and struggle and trials that they're going through. And so as you go through a study of the Psalms that are very similar to this one, you're faced with the reality that there will be and there are troubles in life. The very first verse says, God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. You know, just as we saw the apostles in the boat with Jesus, they were not immune from trouble. And this verse is telling us too that even though God is on our side and even though we walk with Him, we will face times of trouble. And so as you go into this psalm, you immediately encounter the word trouble. And it's a reminder that, yes, we will face that. Job was one who was acquainted with troubles, right? Job was one who suffered more than most men would ever see in their lifetime. Not only did he lose his wealth, not only did he lose the lives of his children, not only did he lose his health. You know, Job was surrounded with people who were beating him down, and that's another form of struggle and another form of trial in itself. His wife wasn't giving him the encouragement that she should have been giving, but she was hurting as well. His friends show up, and they're there, and as comforters, and for days they do nothing but just sit with him, and then they start opening their mouth. And that's another trial. Some of the things that we say, trying to be a help, and all that we're doing is compounding the pain of individuals. Job said, man is few of days and full of trouble, Job 14:1. Joseph Parker once said, preach to the suffering and you'll never lack an audience. There is a broken heart in every pew. As I was thinking about this, I realized there is no if in Scripture in regard to trouble, but when. Notice verse 1. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. He doesn't say God is a help if you fall into trouble. He just assumes we will. I was reading through this psalm, and one of the things I realized is how bold and even frightening the language is. If we keep going into the psalm, you will see this very bold language. He says, God is our refuge and strength, the very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, notice, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. Selah. Stop and think about that. Reflect on that. So as we reflect on these terrifying images, I mean, they're reminiscent of natural disasters. Some of you were asking me about Pikeville, and you said, didn't y'all have some flooding back there a couple years ago? Wasn't a couple years ago. I mean, about every year, really, every other year. But in March, I was standing behind my house at 2 o'clock in the morning with a spotlight looking at the river, because all I could see behind my house was water. And I told my wife, I said, if it gets to our chicken coop, we're out of here. At 2 o'clock in the morning, it got to the chicken coop, and that was about the time the police came in and evacuated the whole neighborhood. We were lucky. We only had about that much water came up in our basement through the pipes, through the drain. I thought what we dealt with in the aftermath, I'm telling you, the idea of swelling waters, that's a scary thing. When you look at this list of the things that he's talking about, the earth being moved, the mountains falling into the sea, the waters roaring, I remember that night, I was standing out there, and I'm the sentinel for my family, right? I'm not going to bed that night. And I'm out there, and I could not see the water or the flooding, but I could hear it. I could hear this water like I've never heard before. I heard trees being ripped out of the ground. As a matter of fact, the thing that really struck us was a tree was coming down the river, and the river was so high it caught in the power lines crossing the river. And I watched this tree get uprooted on that, stand straight up in the air on that power line, and then come crashing down. When I read this psalm, there's a lot of visuals and a lot of memories in regard to natural disasters. And I did a lot of reading from very broadly in regard to this psalm, and it's interesting to me how many people took the idea that, okay, God is with us in the midst of natural disasters. And while that may be true, understanding this is poetic language, I don't think he's really talking about natural disasters. I think he's talking about the disasters and troubles and the crises we face in life. And he's likening them to these natural disasters that we can relate to. I mean, again, think about this figurative language. The earth being moved. You ever feel like something has rocked your world? I had a man stop me as he was coming out of church not that long ago. He's dealing with cancer. And he was just tears in his eyes because stage 4, colon cancer, fighting as hard as he can, doing everything he can. That's a crisis. His earth is being moved, so to speak. You ever feel like the ground beneath you has given way? You ever feel like your life has been shaken, your world has been shaken, or your world is falling apart? When you read those images, the earth being moved, the mountains falling into the sea, the waters roaring and being troubled, the mountains shaking and trembling, I don't think he's just saying, hey, God will be there for you in the natural disaster next time there's a flood. I mean, what's the odds of that happening to us? But I tell you what he's really saying is, the next time you feel like your life is falling apart and the world is shaken beneath your feet and the solid ground you were so boldly walking upon is now quaking, God is there for you and it will help you navigate that difficult terrain. I think it's very figurative, and I think we need to understand what he's coming at. I get choked up at this point. I almost didn't mention this because it's just something that creeps its way into my preaching, and I'm trying not to dwell on it. And I don't want to be known for it. But dealing with a passage like this, I have to let you know why this relates to me and my family. In 2022, in October, we unexpectedly lost our 7-year-old son. I can barely say that without breaking down. The one thing we have been constant in, from the next day, he died on a Saturday. I led my family in prayer and led them to church on Sunday. Not because I wanted to make a show, but because I knew the only way we're going to make it through this is by drawing close to God and His people. We will face times in our life where it feels like the earth has been removed from beneath us. Sometimes those are very short periods, and sometimes those are daily battles. The loss of loved ones, health concerns, financial disasters, conflicts within our families, broken relationships, the struggle with sin and temptation. And the Bible was very open and honest with us when it says, just because you're a child of God, you're not immune from these things. We live in a world that's greatly affected by sin. I preached my son's funeral, and one of the things I wanted people to understand is I was not mad at God. But you want to talk about sin and the effects of sin, because that's what brought death into this world. That's a different story. But this psalm is saying, our God is a refuge and strength and a very present help to face us in our times of trial or trouble. And so make sure that we are seeking Him, because He is a safe harbor in the storm. We go through this psalm and he begins talking about refuge. The refuge that is available for God's people who are going through their times of struggle and trial. And the first thing I think he wants us to understand is when we face those, run to God. Again, so often the opposite happens. When folks have loss, they push people away. when they need people for strength. When we go through trials, one of the first things you'll notice if someone's struggling in a congregation is they'll start missing church. They'll start missing opportunities to be with their brethren. And I understand that. There are times when I wanted to be alone. And there's still times when I want to be alone. But I also know there are times I need to force myself to be with my brethren, because there is, according to Hebrews 10, 24 and 25, there is some encouragement and provocation they can give me that will help me on my journey. And we need not pull away from God, but understand that He is the one true refuge we have during the storms that we face in life. Refuge is a word, an idea that's often found throughout the Psalms. It's a Hebrew word that means place of shelter or protection. There are other words translated refuge, and sometimes those words mean strong tower or fortress. And it's this idea of stability and a place of protection and safety. At Main Street where I preach, this year we spent a long time in Nehemiah. Nehemiah is not a long book, but we were there quite a long time. But one of the things we learned in studying Nehemiah and the context and of his day and age is the importance of a wall. You find out in the book of Nehemiah chapter 4, that 52 days they built the wall. And it seems so, insignificant to us because of where we live and how we live. But in that day and time, if you were out away from the city and an army approached, the enemy was encroaching, where did you go? You're not going to fight them off from your house or your little dwelling. No, you'd run to the city and you'd take refuge behind the wall. And that was the major problem for Israel. God had let them back into the land out of their captivity, and they're supposed to establish themselves as a nation and as a religion and get their identity back, and yet all of these things are being hindered because they don't have a wall. What does that matter? Because then they can't do the things they want to do and establish themselves the way they want to. And so when Nehemiah hears of the situation of his brethren back in Jerusalem, he weeps and he mourns. And he's determined that he's going to make a difference. And he realizes the one thing he can do is bring protection back to the people. And once they are protected and once they are safe, then he works on their identity and their faithfulness to God and worshiping and serving God the way they need to. We need refuge. Where can we run when the storms of life rage? Psalm 46 gives us the answer. We can turn to God. There's another study we did not that long ago. It was Numbers 35. Numbers 35, verses 1 through 15, we read of the cities of refuge. And by the way, I love the concept of the cities of refuge. Go back to the Old Testament. Sometimes people tell me, the Old Testament's boring. I only like a few passages here or there. I find great, so many things that tell us of God and of our purpose, and so many principles that apply to life. To me, it speaks so much of God that as He is getting ready to send His people into the promised land, He says, but one thing we need to do is set 6 cities throughout the land that are cities of refuge. And the idea of having 6 spread throughout the land was that no one was ever beyond a day's journey from the city. And these cities of refuge were for people who were in difficult circumstances. Specifically, if someone had killed another person accidentally. They didn't do it with intent. It was something that happened. You're out there farming, and if you've been in an agricultural community, you understand those times things happen. A lot of times when things like that happen, people want an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and they don't want to know the details of why it happened or how it happened. They just know that you're to blame, and they want their blood. And God understood that, and so He made a provision that if something like this happened, these people could flee to one of these cities. And you know what they'd find there? They would find refuge. No one could avenge them within that city. They would find justice, because it wasn't just a, hey, get out of jail free card. They would go there, and then they would have a trial, and then they would be able to present evidence, and then the truth could have an opportunity to come out. And so when you look at that, you see how God's mind works, and God cares about justice. But you think about that. What would it have been like for somebody in that circumstance running? They know, listen, his family is going to want to know what happened, and they're not going to listen to what I have to say. And I need to get to that place of refuge, that city of refuge. Could you imagine how frantic it would be? Could you imagine if, there are probably times where they're within sight of the city of refuge and people step out of the bushes and grab them, and it's too late. They almost, but not quite, found refuge. I bring that up because I want you to see what the psalmist says. The sons of Korah sing this song. And did you notice in verse 1? God is a very present help in trouble. He is our refuge, and He is present. When we think of God's presence, we're not saying, okay, listen, if I can make it to the church building, then I'll be able to rely on God and commune with God. We have such a blessing. We don't have to travel some distance to find some place to find refuge. We have an ever-present God who says, I'm right here. And nothing that is happening in your life is going to move me from that. Because He's greater than anything we face. And so God's not a day's journey away. He's a very present help in trouble. Paul, in preaching in Acts 17, do you remember what he would say? He is not far from us. They worshiped gods in Athens. They worshiped a pantheon of gods. And all of their gods were distant and far away. And really, if you look at the Greek mythology, they didn't have time for men. Their God stories read like a cheap novel. They're like a soap opera. They're petty and in their own business. And anyone that wanted to call on them, they had to do great things to get God's attention. And in comparison, Paul is preaching the unknown God, who he says is not far from each of us. God is a very present help in trouble. David understood that in his life and all that he went through and all that he faced in life. David said in Psalm 91 and verse 2, He is my refuge and my fortress, and in Him I will trust. You look at David's life, a lot of people abandoned David. A lot of people turned their backs on him at different times, even some in his own family. Even one that he looked to as a father. I believe Saul was that figure at one time. And yet they all turned their back on him, but David could always count on God. I think of the Apostle Paul, who said in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 17, as he talks about those who had abandoned him, and as I read what I believe is the last letter that Paul ever wrote, or at least the last recorded letter that Paul ever wrote, you hear this despair as he knows that his race is almost over. He's about to be poured out as a drink offering, as a sacrifice unto God. And he says, and everybody's left me. But then he says, but the Lord stood with me, strengthening me. See, the Lord is a very present help in trouble. Paul would say, yeah, the others, that some were off fulfilling their duties and doing good things. Others loved the world too much. Paul was alone. But he's able to say, but I wasn't completely alone, because God stood with me. By the way, I couldn't help but think of the very first time we're introduced to that man, to Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul. He witnessed that very thing, didn't he? In the death in the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, as they're raining stones down upon Stephen, he says, I see the Lord standing at the right hand of the throne of God. And so Paul saw something because he was standing right there holding the coats of the guys that were murdering Stephen. He saw something that he later realized in his own life as he walked as a Christian, that the Lord does not desert His people. One more passage I thought of in connection to the ever-present help in trouble. There's a story in 1 Kings chapter 18 where Elijah comes out of hiding and he challenges Ahab and the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth. And so they go up on Mount Carmel, and they have what we call this contest. And Elijah says, listen, you build your altar. You call down to your God to throw fire on that altar. I'll build mine, and I'll call to my God. We'll see who is God. He said, I'm tired of the people faltering between two opinions. We'd say they were riding the fence, not making a decision. He says, once and for all, I'm going to show you who the real God is. And if you follow that story, you'll see that the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth, they're out there dancing and they're shouting and nothing happens. So to get their God's attention, they start cutting themselves and they start, bleeding because, they thought, well, listen, he'll see how serious we are about this. But Elijah's response in the middle of that is so sarcastic and so funny. But it's not funny. But in the midst of all that they're doing, trying to get their God's attention, he says, well, call out. And basically saying, call out even louder. He is either meditating, or he's busy, or he's on a journey, or he's asleep. Now that's my paraphrase of 1 Kings 18:27. But you notice what he's saying? Here they needed their God. And Elijah says, well, where is he? Well, maybe he's sleeping or meditating on a journey. But in contrast, Elijah says a simple, humble prayer. Fire comes down from heaven and destroys the altar and the sacrifice and everything else they put there. In such a dramatic fashion, you realize that God was present. But the gods of this world that so many put their faith and trust in will let them down every time. As we go through this idea, we see that the refuge God offers to His people is real and it is great. And as you go through this psalm, you'll realize that there's more that he has to say in regard to the refuge that he is calling us to. Not only does he mention God's unwavering or unshakable presence, he mentions His unwavering protection and provision. If we take the idea of refuge in the ancient context of running to the city to hide behind the walls and the towers and to find refuge in a time of trouble, that often, not only did it offer protection, but it also brought problems with it. If you have everybody in the area fleeing to a city to hide behind the walls, you know what just happened? Your population behind those walls just increased, didn't it? And now you've got a problem because there's only so much food and there's only so much water. The provisions will only go so far. And so if an enemy came in, they knew that. A lot of times they didn't even want to fight in the skirmishes. They wanted people to hide behind the walls because they just surround the city and it was a waiting game. Are you going to give up? Because we will starve you out and we will cut off your provision. And I think there's something to be said here in verse 4 that kind of combats that idea of refuge that would have been seen in the ancient world. You can flee to God and you can find refuge with God, and His provision will never fail. Read verses 4 and following with me. There is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, and she shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. The nations raged and the kingdoms were moved. He uttered His voice and the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us, and the God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Think about that. There has been a lot written about the context of this particular psalm. If you pick up a lot of different commentaries, most will mention that there are many who believe that this is connected with a situation that happened in Hezekiah's day. The psalm does not mention that. Even in the preface, a lot of the psalms will have a few words of preface. They'll tell us who the author is. There will be some indication about how they were to play or sing that psalm. And sometimes it'll even tell us the occasion for the writing of the psalm. There's nothing in this psalm that mentions Hezekiah or the situation that's found in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19. It's actually found in 2 Chronicles 32 as well, and Isaiah chapters 36 and 37. It's very interesting to me that there's so much that's written about this one situation, because it spans not only the narrative of the kings, but also into Isaiah's work, so he tells us about it also. But it's during the time of Hezekiah that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, invades Judah. He's already taken Israel off into captivity, and now his sights are set on the cities of Judah. He sacks 46 towns and villages in Judah, takes over 200,000 people captive, and he surrounds Jerusalem. This event is actually recorded in history that Sennacherib himself had put out, and some of the things that have been uncovered in archaeology. And he says he shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And this is the way he describes this siege. And so Hezekiah doesn't know what to do, and so he sends word to Isaiah, Isaiah, what do we do? And Isaiah's response is simply, don't lose faith, don't be afraid, trust in God. And that would be hard, wouldn't it? Look outside, you're surrounded by one of the most fierce armies of history up until that time. The Assyrians were not known for their kindness. Sennacherib wanted to make an example out of Hezekiah. Matter of fact, they mock Hezekiah and they mock our God. They stand up there and they say in Hebrew to the people so that they will understand it. They're saying to the people, don't trust what Hezekiah says. He's going to tell you to trust in his God, but look at all the other people we've conquered. They all had gods and I've conquered them all. And so this is quite an ordeal. But if you keep reading, and we don't have time tonight to get into this, but in one night, God destroys that army, 185,000 Assyrians in one night. Now, many people connect that to this psalm, and I think there are three reasons. First of all, it talks about God's a very present help in a time of trouble. Hezekiah, it's called his day of trouble. And so I think there's some connection there. You know, verse 6 says the nations raged, and so this is a time in which the nations were raging. In verse 9, it talks about God making the wars cease. And so many look at that, but I think it's verse 4 that really connects people to this idea. Again, the psalm doesn't say it, but here it is. In verse 4 it says, there is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God. Jerusalem didn't have a river. It's one of the few ancient cities that was not built on the banks of a river. But Hezekiah did do something very awesome. It's actually something you can walk through today if you visit Jerusalem. One day on my bucket list, I'll get to do this. Hezekiah's tunnel is 1,700 feet long. It starts from the Gihon Springs outside the city, goes through solid rock, under the wall and into the city. And Hezekiah did that so that if they were besieged, they would never lose access to fresh water. And some have said, well, that's the river that made the city glad, and therefore, I don't think it's talking about Hezekiah's tongue. That's just, you brought me here to talk about this psalm, that's my opinion, okay? Maybe we can differ on that. I think, again, we're dealing with figurative language. And to me, there's something even far greater that it points to. If you look over into Revelation 22, in verse 1, as he's describing heavenly Jerusalem, that city, he says, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Now, everything that we see there is symbolic, but notice this provision. We need water to live. Do you remember in John 4 when Jesus is talking with the woman at the well, and he says, if you knew who you were talking to, you could ask me for living water, and I would give it to you. She didn't have any understanding. She was thinking he was talking about physical water, and Jesus goes round and round to show her that what I have to offer is so much better. Because we can't go many days without water. And here we have this beautiful picture of the heavenly Jerusalem, and coming from the throne of God is this river. And to me, it speaks of all of the blessings that come from God. And it's reminding us that when we run to Him for refuge, we are not going to be disappointed. God is not going to let us down. When we come to God for refuge, we're not going to be there for a little while and then the provisions run out. But He is the ultimate source of blessings. One lesson I'll take away from Hezekiah, though, one of the great things Hezekiah did is he dug his tunnel long before he needed it. Harvey Mackay, many years ago, wrote a book that is entitled, Dig Your Wells Before You're Thirsty. If you wait until you're dying of thirst to start digging a well, you'll never succeed. You'll die before you reach water. How many times in a spiritual context is that true? We wait to draw near to God and establish a relationship with Him until we're dying of thirst. But how much more abundantly could we have lived if we started digging deep in Him long before those times of need come? We talk about this Psalm 46. And lastly, he shows us the rule of God. He's shown us God's presence, God's provision, God's protection. He's emphasizing that we need to reflect. Selah is seen 2 times so far. It's going to be seen a third. And in verse 8, he opens by saying, "Come, behold the works of the Lord." He wants us to behold. He wants us to examine. He wants us to take a good long look at God and who He is. His power is on display because He says, "Who has made the desolations of the earth? He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots in the fire." You look at those images and you see God's power. All of the things that they feared, God doesn't fear. They are nothing to Him. He is greater than all of these things. And this image that comes at the end of this psalm is one of the sovereignty of God. That He shatters the nations. That some men trust in chariots, Psalm 20 and verse 7. Some in horses, but we will trust in the name of the Lord our God. And in verse 10 he says, "Be still and know that I am God." I know our time's up, but I want to end with this idea. A.W. Tozer once said, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." Now that's a man saying that. Let me quote Scripture. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 32 says, "The people who know their God shall be strong." Be still and know that I am God. We've been studying from Psalm 46 tonight, and we got to a portion of that psalm that really it's very interesting to me because it changes voice. Up until verse 10, we've been talking about God. But in verse 10, God speaks. And He says something that I think is very appropriate for us. I think it's very appropriate for a Wednesday night. I think it's very appropriate in the culture we live and the pace by which we live. Because this is what God says. "Be still and know that I am God." In the midst of conflict, which is the context of this passage, so often we're running around. We're trying to fix things. We're trying to do things. There are things that have to be done. And in the midst of it, God is saying, "Stop and take a good look at me." We already mentioned in the psalm 3 times the word Selah is mentioned, which really means stop. And most believe it means to stop and reflect. And then he says, "Come behold, the works of the Lord." And then God says, "Be still and know." One person has said of this verse that there seems to be a forcefulness here. Even says, be still as a rebuke before it's a comfort. Much like in Jeremiah 6 and verse 16, when Jeremiah pleads with a people who won't listen. And he pleads with them by saying, stand in the way and see, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Quit running in all these different directions and just stop and look around, and you'll see where the good way is. And in much that same way, we hear Psalm 46:10, be still. When's the last time you were still? And all you did was just think about the greatness and majesty and sovereignty of God. When's the last time in the midst of a problem you stopped long enough to remember God's greater than the problems I've faced? And that He is the one who is offering strength, just as He did with Paul. And Paul would say in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. When's the last time we were still? I want to read something to you that was written by Henry Nouwen. And he describes a realization he had one day as he was driving through Los Angeles. We might think of driving down I-40. He said, suddenly I had the strange sensation of driving through a huge dictionary. Wherever I looked, there were words trying to take my eyes from the road. They said, use me, take me, buy me, drink me, smell me, touch me, kiss me, sleep with me. Each day we are bombarded and overloaded with words. They stack up and run together. Eventually we reach a saturation point where the words lose their power and we lose confidence in we lose our confidence in words. Teachers lecture, ministers preach, politicians issue statements, businesses, executives make speeches. Every day, every week, all year, our lives are filled to the brim with words. And then when God speaks, we have no appetite for words. We have no room. We're crowded with activity, crammed with too much conversation, fat with too many words. As T.S. Eliot analyzed, where shall the world be found? Where shall the word resound? Not here. There is not enough silence. Thousands of voices bombard us every day. But tonight, I want you to hear the voice of God. A voice that says, I'm your strength and I'm your refuge. And no matter what you've done, and no matter what you've faced, no matter what you're currently facing, I have the power and I have the answers. The idea of refuge is such a beautiful concept. And He's calling us to peace. And of course, Philippians 4 tells us that in God there's a peace that passes all understanding. And so the world speaks of anxiety and problems, and God's calling us to rest in peace. But He wants us to be still enough to hear His call and His invitation. You see, there's only one true place of refuge. And Paul speaks of it in Colossians 3 and verses 1 through 3. The true place of refuge is hiding our lives in Christ and being in Christ and forsaking the world. And tonight, as we offer this invitation, we are offering you the opportunity to express your belief that Jesus Christ is who He said He was, the Son of God. That we believe in His death, burial, and resurrection. That we would confess His name, that we would repent and turn from sin, and that we would be born again in the waters of baptism, where we come in contact with Christ and where our life is hidden in Him. And then we can fully know and fully understand the concept we've talked about tonight, which is refuge. Tonight, are you listening? Because God is calling. And if you need to obey that call, come while we stand and sing.